Welcome back to the deep dive. We have waded through an enormous pile of sources, biographies, personal memoirs, declassified reports, and we're here to boil it all down.
We want to give you the most vital, the most surprising insights without you having to read 1,000 pages.
Today, we're trying to get our heads around a figure who is just, the ultimate political enigma, François Mitterrand.
France's longest-serving president,
Yeah.
in office from 1981 all the way to 1995.
But it's not just about the length of time he was in power. He was genuinely revolutionary. The first left-wing politician to actually win the presidency under the Fifth Republic. He completely redrew the political map.
He did, but the story, and this is why we're doing this deep dive, it is not some simple linear rise to power.
Yeah.
It's a story of profound, almost unbelievable contradictions.
Right. And that is really the mission today, to get to the heart of this paradox. How does a man who starts his political life as a Catholic nationalist on the far right,
Who works for the collaborationist Vichy regime?
how does that man become a hero of the resistance, and then later, the leader who finally unites the Socialist Party and sweeps them into power?
It's a career built on, you could say, strategic ambiguity, on secrets.
Yeah.
So we're going to trace his entire political journey using all these sources, from his conservative youth right up to his death.
Yeah.
We want to understand what made him such a uniquely very French president.
Okay, so to understand the man, you have to start at the beginning, the foundation.
You do. And his foundation is Jarnac, 1916. A small town. His family was devoutly Catholic, very traditional, very conservative. His father was a station master.
So not exactly a radical upbringing. And when he gets to Paris in 1934 for his studies, his politics reflect that completely. The sources are really clear on this.
Oh, absolutely. He immediately falls in with the ultranationalist right. For about a year, he's a member of the Volontaires Nationaux.
And we should be clear, this isn't just a conservative student club. This was the youth wing of the Croix de Feu, a far-right league.
A very aggressive political group. They were key participants in the February 1934 riots.
The riots that actually brought down a left-wing government. And he wasn't just a member, was he? He was writing.
He was writing articles for Louvre Pyramid, a newspaper very close to those circles. So he's fully immersed. Biographers talk about him being at extremist rallies, demonstrations against what they called the invasion métèque.
A deeply xenophobic term for immigrants?
Exactly. Now, later in life, Mitterrand would always try to downplay this period. He'd say it was just, the folly of youth, the environment he was in.
But the evidence points to a much deeper commitment. Some reports even suggest he had connections, through family and friends, to members of La Cagoule.
Which was an actual far-right terrorist organization in the 30s, setting off bombs. This is the world he was in.
So what happens? How does this guy, steeped in ultranationalism, start to change? Is there a single moment?
It seems to be less of a lightning bolt and more of a slow burn. And it starts with a person. Our sources all point to his friendship, starting around 1938, with a man named Georges Dayan.
Who is a Jewish socialist?
Right. And this close personal friendship seems to have forced Mitterrand to actually confront the anti-Semitic reactionary ideas he'd been surrounded by. It's a pattern you see with him again and again. He was a pragmatist, but he could be profoundly shaped by the people he was close to, no matter their politics.
Then, of course, comes the war, the ultimate test for everyone in that generation. He's mobilized, he's a sergeant.
And he's captured in June 1940. He spends the next year and a half as a prisoner of war in Stalag IXA.
And this experience, he would later claim, was the real catalyst, the thing that finally pushed him to the left.
That was his narrative.
Yeah.
After 2 failed attempts, he finally escapes in December 1941 and makes his way back to unoccupied France, to Vichy France.
And this is where it gets incredibly murky. This is the period that would haunt him for the rest of his life.
It is, because instead of, say, trying to get to London to join de Gaulle, he gets a job, a mid-level civil service job in the Vichy administration.
Which, as you said earlier, for an escaped POW, that's highly unusual.
Very. First at the Legion for Combatants, then at the Office for Reclassifying POWs. Now, his defense was always that this was a cover, a way to do resistance work from the inside.
And there is some evidence for that, right? He was working for a man who turned out to be a British spy.
He was, Jean-Paul Fauve de Thierry. So it's plausible he was helping with disinformation. But at the exact same time, he's publishing an article in a magazine called France, Revue de l'État Nouveau.
A Vichy propaganda magazine.
Pure propaganda. This is why that term, Vichy resistant, is so perfect. It was coined by the historian Jean-Pierre Zema to describe these figures who, they accepted Pétain's authority at first, but then pivoted hard to the resistance later on. They were walking this incredible tightrope.
And nothing illustrates that tightrope better than the Francisque controversy.
Oh, the Francisque. In the spring of 1943, he receives the Order of the Francisque. This was Vichy's highest honor.
And it wasn't just like getting a medal, was it?
Not at all. To receive it, you had to swear a personal oath of loyalty to Marshal Pétain. You were formally committing yourself to the Vichy ideology.
So how does he explain that? If he's a secret resistant, how does he justify swearing an oath to the head of a collaborationist state?
Well, when this all came out in the 1950s, the story got very confused. At first, some said he denied it, that he was just nominated for it, but went into hiding before he could get it.
But then a more convenient story emerged.
A much more convenient story. A prominent socialist resistance leader, Jean-Pierre Bloch, came forward and claimed he actually ordered Mitterrand to accept the medal.
As cover.
As the ultimate deep cover, which, if true, turns an act of collaboration into an act of heroic sacrifice.
But the fact that such an elaborate defense was needed tells you everything, doesn't it? The suspicion never really went away.
It never did. Biographers point to this period as Mitterrand having, a foot in each camp, until it was clear who was going to win. And look at his later actions, his continued friendship with René Bousquet, the Vichy police chief responsible for deporting Jews. His private wreath laying on Pétain's tomb. This wasn't just a youthful mistake, it was a lifelong ambiguity.
An ambiguity that shaped his view of France's official history even as president. In 1994, he was still insisting that the French Republic bore no responsibility for the deportation of the Jews.
He was. He argued it was the work of Vichy France, which he claimed was his illegitimate entity, separate from the real France. He said, I do not believe France is responsible.
A stance that his successors completely rejected.
Forcefully. Jacques Chirac, in 1995, gave that landmark speech acknowledging France's role, the French police who obeyed. And Macron went even further, saying it was indeed France that organized it. So Mitterrand's attempt to sanitize that history was systematically dismantled after he left office.
Okay, but by late 1943, that ambiguity ends. He is, without question, fully in the resistance.
He is. He builds his own network, the RNPG, focused on gathering intelligence from POWs. This was real, dangerous work.
But even within the resistance, there was politics. His network was initially aligned with General Giraud, not de Gaulle.
Right. And that put him on a collision course with the leader of the Free French from day one. De Gaulle had his own guy. He wanted to run the POW networks. Mitterrand, in a move that would define his career, refused to just step aside and merge his group. He wanted to be in charge.
He always wanted to be in charge.
Always. He eventually has to flee to London on a Lysander plane, using the codename Moreland, and then to Algiers. The merger happens, but Mitterrand ends up as the leader.
And what about that first meeting with de Gaulle?
Famously frosty. De Gaulle was deeply suspicious of this independent operator. The best story is from after the liberation. Mitterrand, being Mitterrand, just sort of occupies a vacant government ministry. De Gaulle hears about it and supposedly mutters, "You again," and has him kicked out within 2 weeks.
He saw him as a rival from the very beginning.
Absolutely, a political animal. But before we leave the war, we have to mention his role at the very end, the liberation of the camps.
Yes, in April 45, he's with the Allied forces at the liberation of Dachau.
And he sees the absolute horror. But there's this deeply personal story in our sources. His friend, Robert Antelme, from his resistance network, is there. He's dying of typhus.
And under quarantine, they weren't letting anyone out.
Right. And Mitterrand basically organizes his escape, smuggles him out, risks everything to get him back to France for medical treatment. It's the perfect illustration of the man, a cynical political operator who was also capable of incredible acts of personal loyalty and courage.
So after the war, Mitterrand's rise is just meteoric.
It's stunningly fast. He gets himself elected as a deputy in 1946 under a centrist banner, the RGR. And then in the chaotic Fourth Republic, he just collects cabinet posts.
11 different ministerial portfolios. It's an incredible number.
It speaks to his adaptability and the instability of the government. But the most significant and I think most damaging roles were tied to the Algerian War.
He's interior minister in 1954, right at the start of the conflict.
And that's when he makes that famous hardline statement. Algeria is France. No question of independence.
But the real controversy comes when he's justice minister, from 56 to 57.
Yes, under the socialist Prime Minister Guy Mollet. During his time as justice minister, the sources confirmed he approved the execution of 45 Algerian nationalists. He often recommended rejecting their requests for clemency.
45 executions. For a man who would later become famous for abolishing the death penalty, that is a staggering contradiction.
It is, and critics, like the writer Anthony Daniels, were brutal about this. They basically said Mitterrand was for the death penalty when it was politically popular in the 50s and against it when public opinion shifted by the 80s. It points to a kind of ruthless opportunism. His principles often seem secondary to whatever was necessary for power.
All right, so then comes 1958. The Fourth Republic collapses, and General de Gaulle returns to power. This is a huge setback for Mitterrand.
A massive one. He is one of the very few big names to oppose de Gaulle's return. He campaigns against the new constitution for the Fifth Republic, and he loses his seat. This is the start of his so-called traversée du désert, his time in the political wilderness.
But he uses that time, doesn't he? He reinvents himself.
He does. He becomes the leading intellectual opponent of Gaullism. In 1964, he writes this incredibly influential book, Le coup d'état, The Permanent Coup.
Which is just a brilliant takedown of the Fifth Republic's constitution.
It is. He argues that de Gaulle has concentrated far too much power in the presidency, that he's weakened parliament. He basically frames the entire system as fundamentally undemocratic, and it makes him the ideological leader of the opposition.
But during this period, there's also an incident that almost destroys him, the Observatory affair.
Ah, yes, 1959. Mitterrand claims he's the target of an assassination attempt. Says he had to dive behind a hedge to escape machine gun fire. It gets huge media coverage.
But pretty quickly, people start to suspect he staged the whole thing.
They do. The story seems a bit too convenient, a bit too dramatic. It casts this lasting shadow over his reputation. The whiff of cynicism, of a man desperate for publicity, it really stuck to him for a while.
So how does he survive that politically? A scandal like that would end most careers.
He was just incredibly resilient. But the key moment comes in 1965 when he runs for president against de Gaulle. De Gaulle's advisors tell him, use the Observatory affair, finish him.
And de Gaulle refuses.
He refuses. He says, famously, it would be wrong to demean the office of the presidency since one day he, Mitterrand, may have the job. It's an incredible moment of foresight. De Gaulle recognized Mitterrand's stature, even with all the flaws.
So that 1965 election, even though he loses, it really establishes him as the leader of the left, right?
It does. He manages to unite a big chunk of the non-communist left and, crucially, forces de Gaulle into a second-round runoff, which nobody expected. He proved that a unified left could actually compete.
But the real masterstroke, the big power play, comes a few years later, the 1971 Épinay Congress.
This is the pivotal moment. Mitterrand, who isn't even a lifelong member of the Socialist Party, basically executes a brilliant political takeover.
A coup.
A coup. He builds an alliance with the younger, more radical factions inside the party and ousts the old guard leader, Guy Mollet. His goal was to transform the old, weak Socialist Party into a disciplined machine that could take on the Gaullist state.
And he gives that famous speech defining the new party.
He does. He says, whoever does not accept the break with the established order, with capitalist society, cannot be an adherent of the Socialist Party.
A very clear, very radical statement.
It was a signal. And he immediately puts it into practice by forging an alliance with the French Communist Party, the PCF.
Yeah.
They create the Common Program.
The Union of the Left. And that's what makes him a real contender.
That's the key. In 1974, running on that platform, he almost wins. He gets 49.19% of the vote against Giscard this time.
Giscard famously calls him a man of the past in their debate.
He did. But Mitterrand had laid all the groundwork. He'd united the socialists and communists. And in doing so, he'd started the process of making the socialists the dominant force and beginning the long, slow decline of the Communist Party.
So by the time we get to 1981, his third attempt, he's perfected the image, the quiet force.
Exactly. And he wins. He beats Giscard with nearly 52% of the vote. It was a political earthquake. After 23 years of the right in power, the left had finally won. Mitterrand hadn't just won an election, he had completely remade the French left.
So Mitterrand comes to power in 81, and the atmosphere on the left is just euphoric.
It's electric.
Yeah.
He appoints Pierre Mauroy as prime minister, gets a huge majority in parliament, and even puts 4 communists in his cabinet, which was a huge deal.
And they just hit the ground running with this incredibly ambitious, radical program.
Oh, immediately. The first 2 years are this full-throated Keynesian experiment. They're trying to boost the economy with massive public spending, totally going against the grain of what Thatcher and Reagan were doing elsewhere.
Let's run through some of the changes because the pace is just staggering.
It is. Economically, they nationalize huge swaths of the economy. 5 major industrial groups, all the big private banks, insurance companies.
And on the social front?
A 10% hike in the minimum wage right away. They bring in the 39-hour work week, 5 weeks of paid holiday, and they create the solidarity tax on wealth, aimed squarely at the rich.
And legally, the changes were just as profound.
Abolishing the death penalty. That was a huge symbolic victory. They got rid of special state security courts, a massive regularization of undocumented immigrants.
And just pumping money into the welfare state.
Huge amounts. Pensions went up. Social benefits increased. They brought in retirement at age 60. I mean, it was a complete transformation of the social and economic landscape.
It sounds amazing, but also completely unsustainable. How long could that possibly last?
Not long. 2 years. By March of 1983, it all comes to a screeching halt. Mitterrand is forced into what the French call the tournant de la rigueur, the turn to austerity.
So what went wrong?
The stimulus just overheated the economy. Inflation was soaring, the trade deficit was massive, and they had to devalue the franc 3 times. France was bleeding money and becoming isolated.
He had to choose between his socialist program and France's place in Europe.
That's exactly it. To stay in the European monetary system, which he saw as vital, he had to slam on the brakes. He abandoned the radical spending and pivoted to fighting inflation and fiscal restraint.
That must have been a crushing blow for his supporters, a total betrayal for some. How did he survive it politically?
It was classic Mitterrand. He was a pragmatist. He framed it not as an ideological defeat, but as a necessary choice for Europe. And this is key. He protected the social gains. The 39-hour week, the 5 weeks of holiday, retirement at 60, those stayed. He kept the social architecture, even as he changed the economic engine.
Okay, and right after this U-turn, one of the biggest scandals of his presidency erupts. The sinking of the Rainbow Warrior.
Yes, 1985. The Greenpeace ship is in Auckland, New Zealand, getting ready to protest French nuclear tests.
And Mitterrand authorizes French intelligence, the DGSE, to sink it.
State-sponsored terrorism is what it was. They plant 2 mines on the hull. The ship sinks, and a photographer, Fernando Pereira, is killed.
The New Zealand government was, understandably, furious.
And the Mitterrand government's first response was to deny everything. But then the Kiwis arrest 2 DGSE agents, and the whole story unravels. The defense minister has to resign. France pays millions in compensation.
And it was later confirmed that Mitterrand himself gave the green light.
Yes. The head of the DGSE at the time confirmed it years later. Mitterrand personally authorized the operation. The responsibility goes right to the top.
This all leads to the 1986 legislative elections, which the right wins. And Mitterrand has to appoint his arch-rival Jacques Chirac as prime minister.
The first cohabitation. An unprecedented situation. And Mitterrand plays it like a chess master. He keeps control of foreign policy and defense, his reserved domain.
And uses his presidential powers to just block Chirac at every turn on domestic policy.
Systematically. Chirac wants to pass reforms by decree to speed things up. Mitterrand refuses to sign them. He forces Chirac to go through the slow parliamentary process, which gives the opposition time to organize.
He even reportedly secretly encouraged the student protests against Chirac's university reforms.
He did. He positioned himself as the wise protector of the nation against Chirac's divisive policies. And it worked. By the 1988 presidential election, Mitterrand's popularity was high again, and he easily won re-election against a bruised and battered Chirac.
So his second term, he starts off strong.
He does. And there's a real focus on consolidating the social safety net. The biggest achievement here is the creation of the RMI, the minimum income for the poorest citizens. It's a landmark piece of welfare legislation.
He also brings back some of the policies Chirac had gotten rid of.
Right. The solidarity tax on wealth comes back immediately. And he passes the Gay-Sod Act in 1990, which makes Holocaust denial a crime.
And this is also the period of his grand architectural projects, the Grands Projets.
Yes, he wanted to leave a physical mark on Paris and on France. The Louvre Pyramid is the most famous one, but also the Grand Arche de la Défense, the Bastille Opera, the new National Library.
These were more than just buildings, weren't they?
They were statements about French culture, about presidential power. He quadrupled the National Museum budget. He saw the state as the great patron of the arts, and he used that power to reshape the capital in his image.
But the politics of his second term got messy.
Very messy. He goes through a series of prime ministers. Edith Cresson, the first woman to hold the job, doesn't last long. Then Pierre Bérégovoy, whose government suffers a catastrophic defeat in the 93 election.
The left just gets wiped out.
Annihilated. which leads to the second cohabitation, this time with Edouard Balladur as prime minister.
But this one was different from the first one with Chirac.
Much less confrontational. By this point, Mitterrand's health was failing. He was also deeply affected by Bérégovoy's suicide shortly after the election loss, so he mostly stuck to foreign affairs and let Balladur run the country until his term ended in 1995.
So, after 14 years, what's the verdict on his domestic policy? The radical dream died in '83. What was left?
What was left, and this is what the sources emphasize, was a strong welfare base underpinned by a strong state. He fundamentally reoriented the French economy towards Europe, but he preserved that social safety net.
And what about inequality?
It's a mixed picture.
Yeah.
But some major reports from the time showed that France, unlike the US or the UK, had actually managed to contain the rise in income inequality during that period. He balanced the books, but he didn't dismantle the welfare state to do it.
Okay, let's turn to foreign policy, because this is where you really see Mitterrand's strategic mind at work, especially on Europe.
Absolutely. His relationship with the German Chancellor Helmut Kohl was the central pillar of his foreign policy. They built an incredibly strong Franco-German partnership.
And the biggest test of that partnership came when the Berlin Wall fell. German reunification. Mitterrand was nervous about that, wasn't he?
Deeply nervous. He was worried a bigger, more powerful Germany would dominate Europe and sideline France.
So he makes a deal, a huge strategic bargain.
He does. He tells Kohl, essentially, I will support German reunification, but there is a price. And that price was Germany giving up its most powerful symbol of economic strength, the Deutschmark.
In exchange for a single European currency, the euro.
Exactly. He used the leverage he had at that one specific moment to lock Germany into a much deeper European integration. It was a brilliant, incredibly high-stakes move. And it's what ultimately paved the way for the Maastricht Treaty, which created the modern European Union.
Beyond Europe, he also tried to change France's relationship with its former colonies in Africa, the La Balle speech in 1990.
Right. This was supposed to be a turning point.
Mm-hmm.
He stood up and said that from now on, French aid would be linked to democratic progress, free elections, multi-party systems.
It sounds good on paper. Did it work in practice?
It was complicated. A lot of African leaders weren't happy about it, and there was a massive contradiction at the heart of his Africa policy, personified by his own son.
You're talking about Rwanda.
I am. Throughout the early 90s, Mitterrand's government was providing huge amounts of military and financial support to the Hutu-led government of Rwanda.
Support that was often channeled through a special Africa cell at the Élysée Palace, run by his son, Jean-Christophe.
That's right. France helped train and arm the Rwandan army, which expanded massively with French help. And after the 1994 genocide, this support came under intense scrutiny. It remains one of the darkest chapters of his foreign policy legacy.
And that brings us to the secrets. The hidden life that Mitterrand protected with all the power of the state, starting with his health.
He hid his prostate cancer for almost the entire time he was president, 14 years.
Yeah.
He had his doctor, Claude Gubler, issue fake health reports to the public.
It's an incredible deception, but it pales in comparison to the illegal wiretapping.
It does. Between 1982 and 1986, Mitterrand set up a special anti-terrorist cell inside the Élysée Palace. But this cell operated completely outside the law. No judicial oversight, nothing.
And they tapped thousands of phone calls.
Over 3,000 conversations involving about 150 people. And while the official reason was anti-terrorism, the real reason, as a court later found, was to protect Mitterrand's secrets.
Which were what exactly?
Two main things. First, anything related to his murky past in Vichy. And second, the existence of his illegitimate daughter, Mazarine Pinjot, which he had kept hidden from the public for years.
So he was using the security services as his own private protection squad.
Precisely. They were tapping journalists who were digging into the Rainbow Warrior affair, but also writers and others who he feared might reveal the existence of Mazarine. It was a massive abuse of power.
And did he get away with it?
Not entirely. It took decades. But in 2005, a court finally ruled on the case. Several members of the unit were convicted, and the court named Mitterrand as the inspirator and essentially the controller of the whole illegal operation.
And we should also briefly mention the Urba scandal.
Yes, a big corruption scandal involving illegal financing for the Socialist Party. And just as the investigation was getting close to the top, what does Mitterrand do? He declares a political amnesty, effectively shutting the whole thing down. Another example of him placing himself and his party above the law.
Mitterrand finally leaves office in 1995. He dies not long after, in January 1996, from the cancer he'd hidden for so long.
And even in his final days, he was a figure of defiance and contradiction. That famous last meal.
The Ortolan buntings.
These tiny protected songbirds. It's illegal to hunt them, illegal to eat them, and for his last big meal, he has them served to his closest friends and family.
A final act of defiance against convention.
A final, symbolic breaking of the law. It's so perfectly Mitterrand. The great lawmaker, the statesman, choosing to end his life with this very private, very deliberate transgression.
But his funeral was a huge state affair, a national day of mourning.
It was. Dozens of heads of state came. Representatives from over 170 countries. It showed the stature he had achieved on the world stage.
So, when you look back, how do you balance the ledger on Mitterrand?
It's so difficult. The achievements are monumental. Abolishing the death penalty, anchoring France in Europe, building the modern welfare state, consolidating the Socialist Party.
That deal over German reunification and the euro, that alone shaped the continent for decades.
It did. But then you have the dark side, the Vichy past. The executions during the Algerian War, the Rainbow Warrior, the illegal wiretaps.
We've seen that even after the austerity turn, he managed to preserve that core idea of a strong French state with a robust social safety net. He brought the left to power and kept it there.
He did. So that leaves us with a final question, really.
Yeah.
We've seen this man drag France into a progressive modern era. But to protect himself, to protect his past, he used secret police tactics. He put himself above the law.
So when we evaluate a leader like this, how do we weigh the good at the historic policy achievements against the profound ethical and legal failures? And that's the provocative thought we want to leave you with. Can profound democratic progress ever truly excuse a leader's decision to disregard the rule of law when it gets in the way of their own self-preservation? The life of François Mitterrand suggests that that might be the most unsettling political question of all.